A whip is a super useful training tool for your horse, but the key is using it correctly. And that's what I'm going to show you in today's video. I'm Julia and this is Rumba, and you're watching my weekly show here at the EC Network. When I'm using a whip, I prefer to use a dressage length whip. Now, if I'm going around the jumper course, I will usually use a jumping bat just because it's a little smaller and easier to carry. But when I'm training, I really like having a dressage length whip. First of all, it allows me to use my aid back behind my leg on her hindquarters, which is really where I'm looking for that forward push from her. So again, I like to just have a little bit more length, and I find that it's easier to tap with. So a shorter whip won't allow you to have this nice rhythmic tapping in the same fashion. And that's really what we're looking for when we're asking something with the whip. If you've watched my video on how horses learn, I talk about this in a little bit more detail, but basically using a whip is negative reinforcement. Negative reinforcement means that we are taking away something that the horse doesn't like when they give the desired behavior. So for example, if I want her to take a step forward, I can use my whip, tap until she steps forward, and then I stop. So that's where the negative reinforcement comes in, taking it away. Oftentimes you'll see somebody use either a whip or a jumping bat in a way where they'll take one strong whack on the horse's behind or maybe on their shoulder. And the problem with doing that is that's actually a punishment. And again, if we go back to that video about how horses learn, punishments are, she just heard something. Punishments are not something that we want to be using in our training. It's not the most ethical, and they don't learn as well in those sort of training environments when we're using punishments. So again, using negative reinforcement with the whip is what we want to do. So I'm going to go out and trot a small circle and show you how I can use my whip to encourage a little bit more forward. And really, when you're teaching cues to a horse, you can assign any response to any cue. So for example, if I wanted her to move her hindquarters over at the tap of the whip, I could do that. I would just need to make sure that I'm releasing at the right time for that desired behavior. I like to use the whip to encourage more forward from my horse. Rumba tends to be, most days, maybe not today, we'll see, she tends to be on the lazier side, so I'll use the whip to encourage more forward. So again, I'm going to wait till I come around the circle, but what I'll do is, if she doesn't respond to my leg, I'll just do a little tap, and then as soon as she gives me the response, I'll release. Now she's a little concerned about something in the corner over there, so she's startled a little bit, but that's okay. We're just going to ignore that. If you have a horse that is new to using the whip or hasn't had a ton of exposure to it, I always recommend practicing on the ground first. So getting them used to it, getting them used to the tapping, introducing that cue from the ground so that you have that baseline before you get on. And some horses will even be more reactive with you just carrying it, so that's something that you'll want to keep in mind too. I also really encourage riders who are starting to carry a whip to practice. So it sounds kind of silly, but that motion of just sort of flicking your wrist a little bit, that takes a lot of control in your wrist. So just getting that tapping and that constant motion is a great thing to practice. So I'll do that sometimes if I'm chatting with friends at the barn. I'll just sort of practice doing this with my whip so I have that tapping motion. And I also encourage everyone to do it with their non-dominant hand, which is a little bit more challenging, but you want to make sure you're comfortable carrying the whip on both sides. So again, this is just a simple introduction on how you can use the whip, how it's a great training tool. Again, we want to make sure we're using it in a responsible way, but it can really help encourage more forward from your horse, or really any cue you want to assign to it. Another thing to be mindful of when you're using a whip is your hand carriage, so that you're not using the aid accidentally. Basically, we don't want to be tapping or hitting the horse when we're not intending to. So this is a good time to also be working on your hand carriage. So what I want when I'm riding is I want a straight line from elbow to bit, or in her case, corner of mouth, because she's ridden in a hackamore. So I want to make sure that I'm carrying my hands in a way that I'm keeping it off of the horse. So if I'm holding my reins in this way, that means that it's far enough off of her flank where I'm not going to accidentally tap her, and I'm resting it on my leg. Now, this is where it's also important to note that when you go to use the aid, you have to be a little bit more dynamic in your position. So that might mean that you have to maybe slide the rein and twist your arm a little bit to be able to tap her hindquarters, but we want to go back to that same place with our hand. Another tip I want to share with you in today's video is about switching the sides of your whip. So I like to carry my whip on my inside rein. So for example, if I'm tracking to the right, I'll hold it in my right hand, or if I'm tracking left, then I'll switch it. Now, this is another skill that you can practice, like tapping with the whip, is switching without interrupting your rein contact. So when I do that, what I'll do is I'll flip the whip over, grab it with my other hand, and put it in that hand. There's going to be a little bit of interruption of your contact, but this is a lot easier than stopping and pulling it out like this, which you can do. That's another way to do it. But again, you're kind of having to put your reins in one hand when you're doing that. But practicing this rotation of your wrist, grabbing it with the other hand, and then bringing it back down will make your life so much easier when you're going back and forth between tracking left and tracking right, to make sure that you're holding it in the correct hand. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you give these tips a try, please reach out, let me know how it went, come back, leave a comment, and make sure you subscribe to never miss another video. Thanks so much for watching.